Welcome to this service update on the SKIL Saw Worm Drive Circular Saws. This program includes general tips on troubleshooting, routine maintenance, and common repairs. When servicing any electric power tool, always observe proper safety precautions such as the use of protective eyewear. Start with a visual inspection of the overall tool, including the handle, the base, the motor housing, and the upper and lower blade guards. Inspect the cord and plug as well, and always conduct the standard electrical safety test before proceeding with service. While this service update applies to all SKIL Saw worm drive saws, the saw featured throughout this program is the SAWSQUATCH model SPT70WM22. This saw was built from the ground up to accommodate a 10 1/4 inch blade, so it can cut 4x material in a single pass. Common repairs for worm drive saws may involve the cord, the switch, the lower guard, the motor, and the gears. Worm drives also require periodic lubrication, which is also covered in this program. Please note that all SKIL Saw worm drive saws are fully serviceable tools. To replace the switch, start by separating the handle halves. Then remove the screw that holds the switch to the handle half and remove the wires from the switch. When replacing the cord, remove the white and black wires that go to the switch, then the ground wire attached to the housing. Be sure the ground wire screw attaches the connector securely to the housing. Also examine the strain relief and replace it if needed. Although it is not recommended, some users pick up the saw by the cord and may even lower it from upper floors or ladders. The strain relief helps prevent an internal break in the wires. The saw blade flanges are designed to act as a variable torque clutch to help reduce kickback. This clutching action is provided by the friction of the outer washer against the blade and permits the blade shaft to turn when the blade encounters excessive resistance. If a user reports excessive blade slippage, the blade bolt may be improperly tightened, or the outer flange could be worn and needs to be replaced. The blade bolt should be hand tightened, then turned an extra 1/8 of a turn, or 45 degrees, with the wrench provided. If excessive blade slippage occurs, the blade bolt can be tightened a fraction of a turn more. Over-tightening the blade bolt can nullify the effectiveness of the clutch. If a customer reports that the tool doesn't run, start by checking the switch and the cord for continuity. If they check OK, check the carbon brushes. They should move freely through the holder to contact the armature. If they measure 3/16 of an inch or less in length, they should be replaced. If the brushes don't move freely, look for damage or debris inside the brush holder. Look through the brush holder and check the commutator bars on the armature for damage. If the armature looks good, try cleaning the brush holder with a file. You may have to remove the motor housing to get at the end of the brush holder with the file. If a brush holder is damaged beyond repair, it will need to be replaced. To replace a brush holder, remove the motor housing, then loosen the set screw and slide out the wire from the field. You can then drive out the brush holder with a punch. Note that they are a tight fit and can take some effort to remove. When installing the new brush holder, align the notches on the holder and motor housing, then press in the replacement brush holder and tighten the set screw. To replace the armature, first remove the motor housing. Remove the brushes, then remove the depth adjustment lever. This reveals a housing screw that must also be removed. Next, remove the 4 large motor housing screws. When you remove the motor housing, be mindful of the commutator bearing spring washer in the back of the housing. Set it aside and be sure to put it back in place during reassembly. With the motor housing removed, take off the large plastic cover nut on the front end of the gearbox. You will see some gear lube in the cavity here, and this is considered normal. Remove the stop nut inside on the end of the armature shaft. It's a good practice to replace the stop nut, but it can be reused if it's in good condition. You are now ready to remove the armature by pulling it from the gearbox. If you're not draining the gear oil, be aware of the gearbox orientation so you don't spill on your workbench. With the armature removed, look for signs of oil leakage at the gearbox bearing next to the fan. or accumulated sawdust sticking to the housing. This indicates that the seal or O-ring on the armature shaft should be replaced. Inspect this O-ring even if you don't find signs of oil leakage or sawdust, and replace it if it has distorted and flattened out. Note, the bearing on the commutator end of the armature is not included with the armature assembly. This bearing can be reused if it's in good condition, but if the saw has seen excessive use, you may opt to change the bearing proactively. With the commutator bearing in place, you can install the new armature. Rotate it to be sure the splines on the worm gear fully engage the armature shaft so the retaining nut can be fully tightened. The tightening specification on the stop nut for worm drives is 5 to 7 Newton meters. The tightening process on early worm drives was to tighten the nut firmly, then back it off 1/4 turn. The key is to not over-tighten the nut. With the stop nut secure, rotate the armature by hand and observe the blade shaft turning. The armature and blade shaft should turn smoothly. With the motor housing removed, check the condition of the field. Inspect the wire that wraps around the top of the field. Make sure it is secured to the windings so it won't get cut by the fan. Some discoloration is normal, but if the field is burned up or has damaged wires, it should be replaced. To replace the field, remove the leads from the switch and brush holders, then the mounting screws, and slide the field out of the housing. The worm gear and the gear shaft assembly come as a set, as shown here. Before you remove them, note that the bearings on each end of the gear shaft are not part of the assembly. These can be replaced individually or be reused if they're in good condition. To replace the gears or bearings, you must first drain the oil. Be sure to dispose of the oil properly. With the oil drained, remove the motor housing and armature as described in the previous slides. Next, remove the lower guard. This starts with removal of the blade bolt, which is reverse threaded, followed by the outer blade washer, the customer's blade, if present, and the inner blade washer. Then remove the spiral retainer and flat washer. Now you can remove the guard spring. Note, 7 1/4 inch worm drive saws typically attach the upper guard spring with a hooked end. The upper guard spring is attached a bit differently on this saw. The spring is sandwiched between the upper guard and the gear housing with a bushing. The upper guard and the gear housing must be separated in order to release the spring. With the lower guard removed, you can remove the bellows cover and gasket. Then remove the guard plate, which is held in place by 4 screws. Lift out the gear shaft and bearing assembly, and take note of the spring washer that pushes against the bearing. Be sure to install it when reassembling the gear set. Replace the bearings, gasket, and seal if they are worn or damaged. Be sure to lube the outer bearing if you are reusing the existing one. To remove the worm gear, use a punch from the back to drive out the front armature bearing. The gear will offset enough so the punch can contact the front bearing. With the bearing out, the worm gear will slide out in the same direction. As you remove the worm gear, take note of the splines inside and remember that they go toward the front of the tool. If this is reversed during reassembly, the armature won't fit through the gear far enough. On the opposite side of the gearbox, there is a seal, metal collar, and bearing. The bearing is held in place with 3 retaining screws. Once you remove these, use a punch from the opposite end to remove this bearing. A new bearing comes packed with grease, but if you are reusing the bearing, lube it prior to assembly. Check the oil seal as well. It is a good practice to replace it. Begin reassembling the gearbox by installing the spring washer and then the new blade shaft assembly. Then install the fan side seal, collar, and bearing with the retaining screws. Next, set the worm gear in place with the splines toward the front. Then install the front bearing and seat it into the housing. Put the O-ring on the armature shaft and apply a film of lube on the shaft. Then slide the armature into the gearbox. Rotate the armature back and forth so it fully engages the worm and the stop nut can be fully tightened. Install the stop nut as described earlier. Remember, the key is to not over-tighten the nut. With the stop nut secure, rotate the armature by hand and observe the blade shaft turning. The armature and blade shaft should both turn smoothly. During reassembly, once the armature and gears are in place, you can refill most of the gear oil through the bellows opening. Top off and check the oil level through the oil plug hole with the saw sitting level on your bench. Fill it until oil just starts to run out of the fill hole and then replace the oil plug. Be sure to use only the recommended SKIL heavy-duty worm drive lubricant. Do not use gear oil or grease. Before returning the tool to the customer, adjust the foot so it's 90 degrees to the blade. If the tool came with a blade, remember to return it to the customer. If the teeth are bent or damaged in any way, advise the customer to replace the blade. SKIL saw worm drive saws are warranted for 1 year from the date of purchase, which covers defective parts and workmanship. The warranty does not cover damage caused by abuse or unintended use. SKIL saw also offers a unique 180-day Stay True guarantee that lets the user get a full refund within 180 days of the purchase date for any reason. For more information on the SKIL worm drive circular saws, visit skilsaw.com or the service website shown here. We hope you will refer to this program in the future as needed.